Let me tell you about one of my strangest investigations in my days as a park ranger in the Pacific Northwest. It was an experience that I won't forget for a lifetime. It was midsummer some years ago at Crater Lake National Park, and I found myself knee-deep in reports about a few campers that had gone missing around our park's remote lake. Considering the lake was tucked away amidst a dense expanse of trees, it wasn't all too surprising for a few tourists to lose their way. These types of things would happen from time to time, but we were always able to locate the lost campers and get them back to safety. So I wasn't too alarmed at first, but I took my duties seriously. The safety of our visitors was always my top priority. One day turned into 2 and then 3, and suddenly it was weeks that they had been missing. The odds weren't great, I hate to say. And then another group went missing too. And if I wasn't worried before, I certainly was now. I spent weeks interviewing other campers, scrutinizing each statement, and piecing together any clue that could lead me to the missing folks. Meanwhile, I checked every registered campsite for signs of disturbance or struggle. Many showed signs of a hasty departure, unmade tents, leftover food, even valuables left behind, but there were no clues as to what happened. It was as if the campers had vanished into thin air. The one thing that struck me as odd was the lack of wildlife activity around these deserted campsites. Normally, raccoons and squirrels would be all over an abandoned campsite, but they were nowhere to be found. I turned my attention to the area surrounding the lake, thinking it was a natural focal point. What I saw were the usual signs of a typical summer season: fishing lines caught in the trees, discarded cans and plastic wrappers, and plenty of worn-out foot trails. But as I dug deeper into the wilderness, away from the lapping waves of the lake, I started to encounter something unusual. There were these strange, large footprints pressed into the dirt on some of the less trodden tracks. Now, I've seen plenty of footprints in my day, but none quite like these. They were certainly too large for any human, measuring almost 2 of my feet end on end. And instead of the distinctive tread of a hiking boot, these impressions were, well, barefoot. They had a peculiar roundness to them too, almost human-like, and yet not quite. My responsibilities as a park ranger rarely led me into the realm of the paranormal, but as these footprints were something else. I knew of all the stories. Everyone around here did, but I never once imagined that they might be real. There was an unusual odor that hung heavily in the air the deeper I ventured into the woods. I was familiar with the typical smells of the woods, but there was something inexplicably odd about this smell. It was a pungent, off-putting scent, a sour undertone that made me feel like I was walking into some spoiled, contaminated zone, like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. The further I tracked into the woods, the stronger the foul smell became. Just as the sun's golden glow began to sink behind the trees, I heard a sound rush through the forest. A loud, long howl, completely different from anything I have heard in my long years surrounded by wildlife. It reverberated through the trees and echoed off the distant mountains, making it impossible for me to discern its point of origin. Wherever it came from, I knew I wasn't alone in those woods, and the thought of who or what might be sharing this secluded wilderness with me sent a shiver down my spine. I immediately thought of the missing campers and wondered if our mystery creature had something to do with it. I wanted to investigate further, but my common sense told me to get back to the safety of the ranger station. I decided to press on. I hiked deeper into the woods, following those massive bare footprints. Curiously, they led straight towards a large, hidden cave tucked away amidst the dense thicket. I shivered a little at the entrance. Fingers numb, but the grip on my flashlight was tighter than ever. Moving aside the thick undergrowth, I cautiously ventured in. The closer I moved towards the cave, the sharper the foul smell turned. My flashlight was throwing feeble shadows against the walls of the cavern, but it didn't take long for the beam to fall upon those responsible for my ongoing mysterious puzzle. I found myself looking into the most curious beings I'd ever encountered. It was a Sasquatch family. Powerful, solid, and gargantuan would be an understatement for the creatures I came face to face with that night. I estimate their height to be close to around 8 feet, perhaps just a bit taller. Their burly bodies, covered in dense brown hair, with a reddish tint I could just barely see in the low light. They huddled together towards the end of the cave, their deep-set eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. Something about their wide nostrils flaring and their rough, scarred faces showed me they were as startled by this encounter as I was. A deep, resonant snarl echoed in the cave. Their bulky shoulders moved in the shadows as the colossal beings shifted uneasily. In that instant, I felt an overwhelming mix of fear and respect. Here was a moment of discovery I felt strangely privileged to have, but with it came a realization that my intentions could pose a threat to their existence. I thought again about the missing campers. If these things were responsible, then I was likely to meet the same fate if I stayed there much longer. Nearly stumbling back over my own feet, I slowly retreated, the flashlight bearing my erratic movements. I managed to give them one last look, and those intelligent, worried eyes burned into my consciousness as I turned around and headed back towards my cabin. The night was much longer than usual, and sleep barely floated on the surface. I was surrounded by a different set of truths than what was known and accepted by the public. I wrestled with thoughts of reporting them to my superiors, but I ultimately decided against it. Whatever they were, they let me go, and I figured I would return the favor. In their seclusion, it seemed to me like they wanted to be left in peace and anonymity. And so, they stayed hidden from the world, in the deepest secret I ever held onto. The old folk tales wore a fresh coat of reality, and I found myself adding layers to those already established. The footprints, the odors, the howls, these were now validated as signs of the existence of a magnificent creature I had come across. I never revisited the cave, nor did I share the exact coordinates with anyone else. Their existence remained a secret I bore alone. I was a changed man, a person privy to a secret that was as old as the wilderness itself. As for the issue of the missing folks, though, I began to enforce stricter park rules, halting camping in secluded spots, and introducing hiking companions for anyone willing to adventure into the deep forest. That was the most I could do without revealing the secret I held. Not long ago, I managed to cross off a major item on my bucket list: scuba diving off the coast of Scotland. The rocky coastline harbors some of the key diving spots in the world. I've always been fascinated by underwater exploration. The deep blue darkness, the mysterious shadows, fish darting about as if they're playing hide and seek, and if you're lucky, the thrill of finding something like a lost relic or sunken treasure. On this particular trip, it was a mild summer day when we embarked from the local marina. Dressed in my diving gear, I followed the guide into the water. His name was Ian. He was local to the area and had been leading guided dives for years. As we slipped into the temperate waters, I couldn't help but feel a childlike sense of excitement. That's what diving does to me. Each time feels like the first. The adrenaline rush when you dive deeper, it never gets old. Not for me. The waters off the Scottish coast aren't the crystal clear tropical kind you see on all the internet videos. They are darker here, more enigmatic. The visibility depends entirely on the sun and the currents. Though it was a challenge, I was eager to explore and unravel the secrets I felt were waiting for me below. About half an hour into the dive, following a trail left by a myriad of local sea critters, I stumbled upon what looked like an ancient underwater cave. It was half hidden by a thick growth of seaweed. This spot was not on Ian's usual route. I could see by his surprised expression that he too was unaware of its existence. But there's no thrill without a bit of risk. So, taking a moment to check our gear, we ventured in. Inside, the walls of the cave were speckled with marine life. These tiny creatures had made a whole microcosm separate from the world outside. Our torches glided across the cave floor and revealed an assortment of brilliant objects glistening in the darkness. My heart leaped in my chest as I realized what these objects were. Sunken treasures, ancient coins blanketed by barnacles, jewel-encrusted goblets, pearls. There was even what looked like a royal crest, half buried under the silt. I couldn't believe what we had found, and then, out of nowhere, I felt a sudden shift in the water. I glanced at Ian, His face was masked by poor visibility, but I could still sense an unease in him. His headlamp darted wildly through the water, illuminating bursts of sand and sudden showers of tiny bubbles. Something else was there with us, something that belonged to the underwater cave. There was something living in here. I heard a low rumble grip the water around us. It was then that a sense of dread hit me. I can't explain what caused it, but I just knew we had to get out of there. And as we hurriedly began our retreat, I saw something there in the water. At first, it was just a darting shadow, but it was much larger than a fish or any marine creature I'd ever seen. It was just at the edge of my vision, beyond the reach of our torchlights. The mysterious rumble grew stronger, echoing in the watery silence. I caught a fleeting glimpse of something. It wasn't a fish or shark or turtle or any sea creature I'd ever encountered before. I saw the shadow flicker again, this time in the cave's entrance. A thwack, like a whip cutting the air, echoed around me, creating disorienting ripples in the water. I risked stealing a glance back towards the cave, only for my blood to turn ice cold. What I saw there defies all sanity and rationality. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a bad dream, but I know what I saw down there, and I know it was real. Looking back at me from the dark abyss of the cave were two enormous glowing orbs. These weren't bioluminescent fish. No, these were eyes. Eyes as big as dinner plates and filled with an ominous hypnotic light that seemed to pulsate in the murky water, like they were trying to draw you in. The creature moved further into the light. I could not believe what I saw before me in the entrance of that cave. There were rows upon rows of sharp, oversized teeth that reflected pure white against our lights. The creature had a long, scaled, sinuous body that wrapped around itself like a snake. It appeared to have some type of gills or fins on either side of its face, almost like a dragon out of a storybook. It was entirely too large to be anything known to inhabit these waters. This thing was big enough to sink a boat without much of a struggle at all. Suddenly, all those stories I had heard about sea monsters didn't seem so far-fetched anymore, but the only thought in my mind right then was to get the hell out of there. Ian must have been on the same page because we swam like maniacs, only looking back to make sure the monster wasn't following. Every splash, every sound was amplified by the absolute silence of the underwater world, and every small fish turning in the dark seemed like the beast was after us. We surfaced gasping for air. The boat was nearby, and we hastily clambered aboard. Both of us were trembling. The shock and fear we felt was crystal clear in our eyes. Ian revved the engine and we pulled away from that wretched spot, leaving the treasures and the horror of that creature far behind. Later, wrapped in warm blankets, sipping on strong coffee, Ian and I shared strained smiles. We'd escaped the clutches of a real-life sea monster, a creature whose existence will be questioned and mocked by non-believers, but ignorance sounds like bliss when compared to the memories of those terrifying eyes I saw in the cave that day. I still dive. I couldn't give it up entirely, but I stick to busy places and clearer waters. The Scottish Sea holds its secrets close, but I expect the truth will surface in time. Let me tell you about something that happened a while back, around the tail end of the summer. I live in a small town up in the north of the UK. There's a lot of countryside up that way, mostly farmland and meadows adorned with dry stone walls, and rolling hills that disappear into the distance. It's a great place for walking. I used to take casual evening strolls nearly every day with Max, my golden retriever. There's something magical about the countryside at twilight. Something in the way the dying light casts long shadows across the landscape. It was one of my favorite times to be outdoors. One particular evening, just as the sun was setting, Max and I took to our usual route. It was this little narrow dirt trail that goes through a small stretch of a wooded area before it opens up to a large grassy field. Max was always a bundle of energy. He led the charge, zigzagging and sniffing around, while I enjoyed the tranquility of our surroundings. It was quiet that day in that uncanny sort of way. It was normally pretty quiet out in the evenings, but this seemed just a little too quiet. Nothing that set my senses alight, but it felt just a bit odd. I remember dismissing it as an effect of the ending summer. I always brought a ball for Max and we played some fetch while walking along the trail. He was in high spirits, barking, panting, and thoroughly enjoying himself. It was a simple pleasure to see him like that. And then, as I was watching him dart about, I noticed he'd suddenly gone quite stiff. I followed his gaze and squinted at this dark mass in the distance. I thought it was maybe a cow or something. It was fairly indistinct and, frankly, too far away for me to even get an idea of what it could be. I whistled for Max to come over, but he seemed glued to the spot. This is around when I felt this icy sense of foreboding, like a shiver running down my spine. Max was growling now, a low, menacing rumble. It was not at all like him. The figure seemed bigger and was animated in a way that erased my previous thoughts of it being a cow or a sheep. I was pretty spooked by then. We were in the middle of nowhere and there was no direct path back to my house from the field. My fingers fumbled for my phone, just as Max let out a brave, protective bark towards the strange figure in the distance. And as he did, the figure let out a bone-chilling howl in reply. I quick grabbed Max and started to drag him away. Whatever that thing was, I knew it wasn't some stray farm dog. It was something else. I knew we had to get away. We had to pass by the creature to get to the other side of the field. I thought for a moment that I saw a flicker of red in its eyes, but I brushed it off. No animal in the English countryside has red eyes. I must have been mistaken. But then it stepped out of the shadows and into the field. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. This creature was black as a moonless night, its matted fur or perhaps scales glistening eerily in the fleeting sunlight. It seemed to be the shape of a dog or a wolf. I could see the eyes clearly now. They were indeed red and almost seemed to have a glow to them, a glow that didn't come from anything belonging to this world. The whole image was deeply unsettling, but it was more than the sight of the creature that unnerved me. It reeked of sulfur and perhaps something burned. I couldn't quite place it, but I can tell you it was unnatural in every way. The creature seemed to be as surprised as we were, perhaps even scared. It and Max stared at each other for a brief moment. Then it opened its mouth, revealing its teeth, and it let out a growl so thunderous that it seemed to roll uphill and on forever. The creature, now all too real, abruptly turned and vanished into the trees like it was a ghost. The tension evaporated from Max as he sat by my side, but his eyes never left the spot where the creature was last seen. Max and I hastened home, both of us ever so eager to escape the countryside for the night. The rest of the evening felt surreally ordinary. My walks were never the same after that summer evening. The image of those fierce red eyes continued to haunt me. I kept my walks to the daylight. The landscape had certainly lost a bit of its charm after that. I will say I do miss my twilight walks, but I have no desire to run into that creature again. I don't think it was from this world. I've heard stories of creatures, of monsters and spirits that live out in the fields and moors around here, but I had never paid them any mind before. I don't like to entertain the existence of such things, for my own sanity, but what else could it have been? Everything else I could explain away except for those eyes, those unnatural red eyes. They are my proof that something is really, truly out there roaming the countryside as it wishes. I've got a story for you. This one's coming right out of the Twilight Zone. My girlfriend, Lila, and I, we're all about nature, and camping is one of our favorite ways to get out there. One time we were in this remote piece of woodland. It was a few miles from civilization, no cell service, and not another soul for miles. Perfect for us. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sunlight cutting through the dense canopies and illuminating intricate patterns on the forest floor. We pitched our tent and got our little camp all set up. It was a picture-perfect campsite, right next to a slow-moving brook. The first thing that struck me was the silence out there. Not a dreadful silence, but the tranquil calm of the wilderness. The day slowly moved to night, and you could see the shimmer of countless stars speckled across the sky. It's just something you can't get in the city. We were enjoying a late-night dinner over the campfire when I noticed a strange light in the sky. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a bright star, but what caught my attention was that it was moving in an irregular manner. I've seen shooting stars before, but this was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its movement wasn't like a plane or a chopper either. It would hover at points in complete silence, then suddenly accelerate at unbelievable speeds. It was large and spherical, glowing in an eerie metallic silver light, which seemed to radiate from the object itself. Before Lila and I could even begin to question the weird light's origins, it started performing some inexplicable aerial maneuvers, zigzagging across the sky. The weird thing was, we didn't hear any noise. Any aircraft big enough to create that much light would have definitely made some type of noise, but there was just nothing. I remember looking at Lila and asking, "Do you think it could be aliens?" Because I didn't have any other ideas. And believe me, I would have loved a logical explanation for this, because the thought that this might be something extraterrestrial isn't the kind of thing I wanted to think about in our little isolated spot out in the wilderness. Everything suddenly became eerily silent. The familiar sounds of squirrels rustling about in the leaves, the croaking frogs, the chirping crickets, all of it just stopped. Even the wind blowing through the trees seemed to still, and the strangeness didn't stop there. The hovering light started to descend towards the clearing nearby. I couldn't believe what we were seeing. It was like time had just stopped. The sphere of light gradually transformed into a large cylindrical object. It must have been around 100 feet in diameter. It was metallic and gray in color. I remember Lila squeezed my hand hard, her eyes wide with a mix of alarm and fascination. We couldn't take our eyes off it. Suddenly, this low, resonating hum filled the air as the craft grazed the edge of our campsite and landed in the clearing just a stone's throw away. The hum intensified. It reminded me of the buzz of power lines. And then, an opening appeared on the side of the craft. In the entrance, we could see these small, gray beings. They were short in stature but had long limbs, almost too long for their bodies. They moved around as if conducting some analysis of the area. It was like they were scientists of some sort. Lila and I hid behind our tent, trying to keep ourselves out of their sight. We watched these beings collecting soil and plant samples. It was as surreal could get. If Lila wasn't there with me, I would have been sure this was some sort of dream, or perhaps a nightmare. After what seemed like an eternity, the beings re-entered their spacecraft. Instantly, the hum stopped, and the object began to ascend, spinning in a slow, smooth motion against the dark sky. In a blink, the strange, large, cylindrical object shot up into the sky. We were frozen in place as we watched it disappear. Once we were sure we were alone again, Lila and I returned to our tent. We hardly slept, whispering about what we'd just witnessed, our minds racing. Our understanding of reality shook to the core. Would anyone else believe our story? It seemed so impossible, and if I hadn't witnessed it myself, I'm not sure that I would have believed it either. The only thing I can say for sure is that we aren't alone out here. I don't know if that is something to fear, or if it is a comfort. I don't know if the creatures knew we were there or not that night. I often wonder what would have happened if they had seen us. But then, maybe that's an avenue that is better left unexplored. Either way, there are others in our universe. Whether they are friendly or not isn't something I found out. I just know that they are there. I arrived on a typical, dreary autumn day to the old Carter Mansion on Woodbury Lane, here in Massachusetts. An overcast sky loomed overhead, the sun hidden behind thick clouds, casting gray shadows everywhere. It was weather that perfectly painted the grim task I had been summoned for. I'm not the sort who's quick to believe in supernatural haunts. I've always thought of myself as logical, almost to a fault. My mission that day was an exorcism. I know what you must be thinking, but most of these cases are in the mind. Most often I'm not confronting literal demons, but freeing tortured people from their delusions. I say most often because sometimes you do run into evils of the supernatural sort, but it is very, very rare. I carried all the typical things with me: I lugged my bag of blessed salt, crucifix, holy water, and Bible up the cobblestone path. I could finally see the mansion in its full, intimidating glory. It was an old Victorian structure, and it bore an air of forgotten grandeur. Today it towered ominously against the gray sky. The latticework of bare branches that ornamented the mansion seemed like skeletal arms reaching out in despair for salvation. It was almost comical how frightening it looked, like something straight out of an Edgar Allan Poe tale. The Carter Mansion was renowned in these parts, and whispers of its occupants' demise were passed around like a chilling tale each Halloween. The news these days was that the family residing there have been tormented by unearthly occurrences, ominous sightings and eerie voices, that type of thing. Stepping on the creaky wooden porch, I couldn't help but reflect on the impending exorcism. I've done dozens, no, hundreds over my career. Yet, that afternoon, I experienced an unsettling sense of hesitation. Had I prepared sufficiently beforehand? I had fasted, I had prayed, but was it enough? There was something different in the air that I couldn't put my finger on. Once inside, I was led by a trembling maid to the attic, the supposed heart of the occurrences. The disquiet from the mansion seemed to seep into the very marrow of my bones. Each squeaking step towards the attic echoed through the house. My heart pounded in my chest. Setting up my tools, I lit several candles around the room, their flickering shadows dancing on the high, curved ceilings and wood-paneled walls. The air was laced with a strange smell, tinged with something akin to an old basement or burnt wood. Sometimes old houses have odd smells, so I tried not to put too much stock in it. But the temperature was surprisingly frigid for an attic. The unease I felt upon arrival now felt more tangible. I could hear the house groaning, whispering inaudible secrets as the wind blew outside. The crucifix around my neck felt unexpectedly heavy. I forced myself to dismiss my feelings of paranoia, reminding myself of the task at hand. I began to recite verses from the Bible. Every word felt crucial, yet they seemed to echo hollowness within the cold attic. Surely this was my mind playing games. It had to be. Suddenly I heard something, a low growl, or was it a distant rumble of thunder? The slight disturbance in the otherwise silence had me straining my ears, heart pounding once again. But all became quiet again. The noises outside were nothing more than the rustling leaves in the wind. As I looked around the dimly lit space, my stomach churned with uncertainty. There was a sense of something palpable in the air. It was like a pressurized sensation of charged energy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. Though I saw nothing unusual then, the oppressive mood continued. My sense of anticipation grew, and it was far from comforting. It was there right then when it hit me, an icy touch running down my spine that made the hairs in the back of my neck stand on end. This was not the simple delusion of a tortured mind. There was something else there with us. Even in my extensive religious training and experiences in exorcism, nothing had prepared me for what I was about to encounter. The atmosphere grew tense suddenly, and then it began to laugh, a bone-chilling cackle, echoing all around. The blood in my veins froze. More often than not, these cases were simple struggles of the mind, or perhaps a lost spirit. But once in a while, there would be something else, something truly evil. I knew I was up against something much older and far more insidious than I had ever come across, and the real challenge was only beginning. Suddenly the room darkened, and the musty smell gave way to a more distinct pungent odor, like burning coal or sulfur. The flickering shadows grew almost sentient, dancing manically across the ceiling, and the chill I'd initially noticed seemed to grow deeper, like it was inside me. I fought to maintain concentration on my prayers, my voice wavering around psalms and supplications. Yet, with each passing second, the room's atmosphere seemed to thicken, the darkness seemed to deepen, and the air almost shivered with an unspeakable evil. Within the sprawling darkness, I detected a flicker of movement, the briefest hint of a shape. My blood ran cold as a sudden eerie whisper cut through the silence, a chorus of voices that felt unnatural against the backdrop of my echoing prayers. The murmurs grew louder, morphing into a chuckle that reverberated off the wooden walls. Without warning, the physical world around me seemed to distort. Shifting dark pockets formed grotesque silhouettes that seemed to morph into demonic shapes with horns, wings, and claws. I clenched my fists, holding tightly to the crucifix in my hand. Despite my rattling nerves, I forced myself to continue, channeling all my fear into defiance. As abruptly as it had begun, everything stopped. The laughter, the whispers, they all fell silent. The room lightened, and the temperature rose as any trace of the grotesque shadow disappeared. The mansion seemed to exhale, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. Throwing a wary glance around, I couldn't help but wonder if it all had been just a creation of my distressed mind, or the calm before the storm. I sunk onto a dilapidated stool, mentally shaken and physically drained. I was far from done. It couldn't have been that easy. As I sat there, surrounded by the deceptive peace, I knew that I was up against something far more malevolent and cunning than I was prepared for. An unearthly encounter with an entity that didn't conform to our understanding. This was not some wayward ghost. This was a demon. And it was not a fight I would be able to take on my own. I knew that much. I've had to leave the Carter Mansion for now. The demon is still out there roaming loose in a world that it shouldn't be allowed to exist in. But I know I cannot send it back to hell alone. I'm a part of a small group of cryptozoologists, and a few years ago, we had an experience in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey that I reckon your audience might find deeply intriguing. Before I launch into the story, let me set some context. We're not your typical monster hunters. We started off as a bunch of science nerds at Rutgers University, with a shared love for the weird and unexplainable. Our fascination brought us together, and before long, we were baptized as cryptozoologists by our beloved biology professor. Over the years, we've had our shares of adventures, mostly chasing obscure species, documenting strange migration patterns and the likes. However, nothing measures up to the experience we had during the winter of 2013. The adventure started when a wealthy businessman, whose name we are not allowed to share, heard about our group. He was a bit odd, but so were we. He had a passion for the bizarre and a burning curiosity about the world of cryptids. He was convinced that the infamous Jersey Devil existed, and he had an offer we could hardly resist. He was well off and offered a monetary reward for any credible proof of the existence of the creature. Now, it's not that we hadn't heard about the Jersey Devil before. The supernatural creature was right up our alley. The beast, as large as a horse but bizarrely devilish, with glowing eyes and bat-like wings, had been a tale shared around late-night campfires for centuries. The reports varied, of course, adding to its mystique. Some spoke of horns, whereas others of a skeletal exterior that gave it an eerie, goblin-like appearance. For some, the creature was known to emit a harsh, sulfur-like smell that hung in the air long after it disappeared. Each of us in our team had different motivations to accept the challenge. Of course, the promise of the reward was enticing. But more than the money, we were enamored by the idea of potential fame and the rare opportunity to finally prove the existence of a cryptid to the world. Pete, our team leader, was particularly keen on getting his hands dirty and was eager to venture into the Pine Barrens. But we needed to bring back hard evidence, something more than just blurry pictures and hearsay. To track a creature as elusive as the Jersey Devil in the vast 1.1 million acres of the Pine Barrens was no small task. We spent days poring over old records, witness accounts, and local folklore, identifying key spots where the creature had been sighted most frequently. Our plan was illustrious. Not only would we venture into the area, but we'd camp there for a week, moving deeper into the heart of the Barrens each day. We were arming ourselves with thermal cameras, drones, and the best video recorders money could buy in 2013. No stone was left unturned. No cost was too much. The excitement among us was mounting as the day of our big search came closer. Little did we know, nothing could have prepared us for what was about to unfold in the depths of the Barrens. It was about 2 days into our Pine Barrens adventure when it started. We were sitting around the crackling fire. Suddenly, we heard a sound that made our blood freeze. It was a bone-chillingly strange, high-pitched cry that echoed throughout the forest. It was something none of us had ever heard before in all our expeditions. Our drones and cameras sprung to life in anticipation, but the creature did not appear. The third night was when we first saw it, or more accurately, smelt it. A stench of sulfur filled the air, so strong that it instantly killed our appetite. The smell lingered for a while, but then began to dissipate. We couldn't find any cause or source of the smell, and we stopped searching after it seemed to disappear. We were just tucking ourselves into our sleeping bags, heads filled with fresh stories when a cry echoed out. Whatever it was close to our camp. But it wasn't just the call that froze us in place. We were assembled together in our main tent when an enormous shadow passed over us. It obscured the moonlight through the thin fabric of our tent. As it got closer, we realized what we were looking at. It was the chilling outline of a winged beast. Braving instinct, Pete and I grabbed our thermal cameras and stepped outside. And there it was, an image that it's as fresh today as it was then. A creature about 6 feet tall stood not 50 feet from our camp, its long, lurid tongue lolled out of its mouth in the darkness, almost like a snake tasting the air. I knew right away we were looking at the devil. It seemed to have a skeletal exterior, or perhaps some sort of plate scales. I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. We had chased shadows and obscure species for the better part of our lives, but it was all just for fun. I never thought I'd actually encounter one like this. Fear was palpable in the air as the creature spread its wings. They were bat-like and membranous. I fumbled to get a steady shot despite my shaking hands, the red recording light glowing weakly in front of me. It was clear the creature didn't appreciate our intrusion, sending another petrifying screech our way, leaving us frozen in fear. Then, as sudden as it had appeared, it took off, leaving only the sulfuric stench and terror-filled silence in its wake. I'm not embarrassed to admit it. We packed up the very next morning. The cameras, drones, all our elaborately planned tracking routines. None of it mattered. No one wanted to be out there anymore. It was like the case of a dog chasing a car. It's there for the chase. It doesn't actually want to catch the car. But there we were. We had finally come face to face with one of the creatures we had been searching for. The Pine Barrens had chewed us up and spat us out, leaving a terrifying tail and 4 petrified men in its wake. We've often reflected on that night, each of us acknowledging that, in our chase for fame and validation, we had bitten off more than we could chew. So, does the Jersey Devil exist? After that expedition, our view tilted from skeptical scientists to reluctant believers. As for our buddy, the wealthy businessman, we offered him our recordings, but without the creature in plain sight, he didn't part with his money. But I can tell you one thing for certain. All the money in the world isn't worth a night spent out in the wild with the devil. I've got a wild encounter to share. We were on a family vacation in a remote cabin, in the heart of the Canadian wilderness. It was wintertime and the landscape was draped in a thick layer of brilliant white snow. We had packed ourselves into the family car and journeyed from the hustle of the city to the peace and tranquility of the great northern forests. It promised to be a perfect week of quality family time, away from the pressures of jobs, school, and traffic. Little did we know what we were getting ourselves into. As a father, I just wanted to give my kids an experience in nature, something more than just malls and movie theaters and theme parks. I wanted them to breathe fresh air, see stars in a black night sky. I wanted them to know the world was bigger than the concrete jungle we called home. My wife was skeptical at first, but she could see the longing in my eyes and the growing excitement in the kids. We all needed this. We pulled up to the cabin on a clear, cold day. The air was crisp and sharp, cutting through our winter wear with a rigorous chill. We blew smoke clouds into the air as we stepped outside. It was a beautiful escape, rustic, raw, and real. No television, no traffic noise, just the sounds of nature. It was exactly what I had hoped for. We settled in, choosing rooms and getting a fire going in the fireplace. The kids dashed in and out, getting used to their new playground. Snowball fights, building snowmen, everything was so alive and magical. The missus and I, well, we were content to just sit by the fire sipping hot cocoa. As the sun began to set, we called it a day. We played a quick board game together with the kids in front of the fire. The night passed uneventfully, or at least I thought. I woke up that morning to the smell of breakfast. The kids were already running around, ready to head back outside. The day went as expected. We explored the surrounding woods and found a nearby sledding hill. We all even made an attempt to ice fish on a frozen lake, not too far from our cozy little cabin. As night fell again, we gathered for another session of board games, laughing and arguing over Monopoly deals. A perfect day ended with us all falling asleep, full of good food and wide smiles. It was in the middle of that night when I was roused by a faint, strange noise. It was a distant, ethereal sound, something between a mournful howl and a distressed cry. Was it an animal? A wolf, maybe? I was unsure, but I shook off the disturbance and drifted back to sleep, clueless about what was yet to unfold. It was the following day when the world as we knew it began to twist and distort. We noticed signs that something strange was happening. The bright expanse of snow showed signs of something large that had trampled through the night before. Unfamiliar tracks marked the land, the separation wider than any animal we knew of. When night fell, the distant noise came back, and this time it was closer. Something about it clawed at my insides. It was unsettling. The normal comforting night sounds of the cabin were drowned by that low and mournful cry. The kids heard it this time. They were pretty spooked, but we told them it was just an animal. Nothing to worry about. We had no way of knowing then, but our perfect little quiet vacation was hurtling towards a reality we never dreamed of. I decided to stay awake that night, straining to listen beyond the comforting crackle of the fire. As much as I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that a malevolent force was closing in on us. The next morning, after breakfast, I got my winter boots on and decided to venture further into the woods. I spent the entire night awake listening to something out there. I figured I would at least be able to figure out what kind of creature it was, even if it was long gone by daylight. I stocked up on provisions and strapped a hunting knife to my belt, just in case. My wife had that worried crease in between her brows, and the kids were exchanging nervous glances. They knew something was off. I promised them I'd be back soon and stepped outside. Soon enough, the trail led me to a clearing that was sickly silent. Instinct pushed me forward, as I walked further until my boots crunched on something that was definitely not snow. I looked down to see bone fragments scattered around. Then the smell hit me. It was a nauseating, rancid stench of flesh that was long past its expiry. Revulsion clawed at my innards. The realization hit me hard. Whatever was responsible for this grotesque display of nature gone awry was probably not too far away. I remember turning on my heel, intent on sprinting back to the cabin, and that's when I saw the true horror of the situation. At the edge of the clearing, clinging to the shadow of the trees, was a beast that I can only describe as some sort of monster. It wasn't at all like any animal that lived in the Canadian woods. It stood taller than any man I've ever seen. Its height was easily verging on 8 feet at least. 2 prominent antlers crested its skull-like head. The head seemed to be a perverse fusion of a man and a deer. There were no eyes in its empty sockets, but they seemed to have a yellow glow coming from the darkness. Its legs resembled those of an elk, but large, with appendages that hung loosely from exposed bone. The stench was emanating from it, no doubt. It was the rotting flesh on its skeletal body. In that moment, terror froze me to the spot. I mustered the will to backpedal, only for my foot to collide with the skull, sending a crack echoing through the quiet clearing. The creature turned its face towards me and my blood seemed to freeze. Our eyes met, its eyes glowing brighter, almost as if it was sizing me up. I pivoted around and broke into a run. The deafening silence of the clearing gave way to frantic, pounding footsteps echoing behind me. The cabin was in sight, and I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning on it as I tried to catch my breath. I spent the night looking out the window, watching for any sign of movement, but there was none. My family was safe and sound, tucked into their rooms, oblivious to the near catastrophe. After what felt like hours, Emily, my eldest daughter, tiptoed down to join me. She didn't ask any questions, just wrapped me in a side hug, her small form a comforting presence. Sleep never graced our eyes that night. As the first rays of sun washed upon the cabin, I finally let myself feel the relief. We'd survived, we were safe. We cut the trip short and we headed back to the city, back to the gray night studded with artificial stars and the white noise of the traffic. I wouldn't say I'd never go into the wilderness again, but I would certainly be more mindful. I reckon after this experience, I'd trade off ignorance for caution any day. This was a few years back now, probably around late September or early October. I don't remember the year right off, but I do remember I was still a teenager at the time. The location was none other than Point Pleasant, West Virginia, specifically the notorious TNT area. Yeah, I know, you've heard of it before. And it's likely that nothing good ever happens in a place nicknamed after explosives. I was there because of this dare amongst me and my friends. We were stupid teenagers back then, always trying to prove how brave we are. This particular dare involved exploring the TNT area at night. There were a ton of ghost stories surrounding the area, and one was that nobody ever comes back the same when they explore that place in the dark. I was always skeptical about urban legends, even back then, and I was never one to turn down a dare, but this time it felt a little more real. If the rest of the guys weren't all pumped up to see this place after sundown, I probably would have backed out. But I didn't have the guts to do that, and we all ended up headed down there. So there we were, a bunch of dumb kids betting on who could stay the longest in the TNT area. We all tried to scare each other with ghost stories to see who would be the first to back out. The moment I set foot in that place, it felt like another universe. It was eerily quiet, like you could hear your heart pumping in your chest. The silhouette of the leftover structures looked like remnants from a haunted past, and weirdly enough, they cast long, creepy shadows that looked like elongated monsters. I gulped and put on a brave face, all the while wishing this whole thing would end soon. Surprisingly, the moon was the only thing that seemed friendly in that grim atmosphere. Its light highlighted the wild, overgrown vegetation. But as mesmerizing as it was, the noise nearby set my senses on alert. Deep down inside, I was kicking myself for not backing out when I had the chance. But there was obviously no turning back now. As I walked further into the night, my heart beat so loud it was audible. My hand instinctively clung onto the flashlight I was holding. Its light wasn't nearly bright enough to ease my mind of the things the shadows could be hiding. My flashlight beam danced over dead logs, rusty barrels, and empty structures, while auditory hallucinations took over, and each snap of a twig sounded like something was creeping up behind me. I kept trying to reassure myself that there was nothing out there, but then my flashlight picked up on a pair of glowing red eyes. They weren't like any normal animal's eyes. They were too high off the ground and too intense. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. It was as if time had completely halted. As I tried to make sense of the situation, my trembling hand moved the flashlight upwards ever so slightly. What I saw was something I still find hard to believe. There, hanging onto a dilapidated structure's roof, was something absolutely horrifying. It was a large figure, around 5 or 6 feet in height. Its body seemed human-like, but it was covered with some black material. I'd say they were feathers if I didn't know better. In the next moment, the moonlight shone through the roof, illuminating the creature's wings. They were enormous, possibly even larger than its body was tall. They looked leathery and bat-like, completely unsuited for the human-like body it was attached to. I wish I could tell you more about the creature's face, but there was none. I mean, of course, it had a head, albeit a small one compared to its body, but it had no distinguishable facial features, just a pair of eyes, dreadfully large and red. Fear is a funny thing, you know. Sometimes it just freezes you on the spot, and sometimes it fuels you with an adrenaline rush like no other. For me, it was a mix of both. There I stood, frozen by the sight, and yet I felt this surge of energy bubbling within me. Following what felt like an eternity, My survival instinct finally kicked in. I dropped my flashlight, turned, and bolted. I didn't dare look back. My only goal was to get as far away as possible from that ungodly creature and those piercing red eyes. As I made my way out, I heard a sharp, deafening screech that echoed in the night. But then again, maybe that was just my heart hammering in my ears. I didn't stop to find out. I ran back to the safety of my friends. They had a field day with my terrified reaction until they all had their turns to face the terror of the TNT area. I won't go into their stories, but let's just say the dare was called off after only one more of us ventured in. And we all came back home with a newfound respect for local legends. To this day, those red eyes still live vividly in my memories, even though it's been years since the event. I don't spend much time hanging around spooky places anymore, but for those of you that do, I have some parting advice. Keep your wits about you. You never know when those local legends might turn out to be true. This happened a while ago when I went fishing on Lake Michigan. People hear the word lake, and they think of calm waters and good weather. But the Great Lakes are different. They're huge. They're more like inland seas, and some of the wilderness areas around them can be rugged and unforgiving. As an avid fisherman, I spent a lot of time up there. My idea of relaxation involved my trusty fishing rod, a clear day, and, if I was lucky, a monstrous pike at the end of my line. That day started out perfect. Something about the hum of the water and the occasional screech of a gull was like music to my ears. Moreover, if there's one high in this world that tops them all, it's the thrill and suspense of that tug on the fishing line when you've got a big one biting. That's one irresistible high for me. I think just about every fisherman can agree with me there. I arrived at dawn, the eastern sky ablaze with red. I took my time as I pulled out my fishing gear and prepared my boat. Before the sun could even hint at its peak, I slid smoothly over the dark, glassy water. After a short while, I found the perfect spot, a quiet, calm patch of water just beyond the bay and out of the wind. I cast my line into the water with a satisfying plop and settled into the waiting game. It was a way to clear my mind and relax. I could spend countless hours out there with nothing but my thoughts and the rhythmic lapping of the water against the hull of the boat. With every minute that passed, I found myself sinking deeper into the silence, my mind relaxing with the waves. The world couldn't have been more perfect at that moment. But that isn't the reason I wrote into your channel. There was also a stirring in the air that day. It started a few hours in, a sense of unease that seeped into my tranquility. That's when things took an unfamiliar turn. I heard a sudden and unsettling low growl. I looked around but couldn't locate the source. I wasn't particularly worried since such sounds were part of the usual soundscape. There are always critters about, and I wasn't too terribly far from shore. But then it happened again, and it was louder. I felt a sudden wave of cold air come off the water, and with it came a putrid smell of something obscenely rank. It wasn't fishy. I didn't think it was coming from the lake. It was a musty, dank smell, almost like rancid garbage. The hair on my neck stood up. My skin crawled as I turned around with a sense of overwhelming dread. I saw a fleeting silhouette right at the edge of the forest where it met the lake. It was just a silhouette, but it terrified me right to the core. The beast was tall as a man, I would say. It was standing upright but hunched over at the shoulders. At first, I thought it was a bear. Black bears are pretty common around the lakes, but then I saw its eyes, and I knew it was no bear. The eyes were yellow and glowing, and worst of all, they seemed fixated on me. If I didn't know better, I would say this thing had the head of a wolf, but there is just no way that could be. Things like that didn't exist. They couldn't exist. I was totally dumbstruck. As I sat there trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing, the figure disappeared into the trees. I reeled in my line, pulled up my anchor, and made my way back to shore. I didn't think the creature was about to swim out there after me, but I just couldn't relax again on the water after seeing it. As I neared the boat launch, I had to pass by a section of forest. I completely missed the thing at first, believing it was just a pile of brush or something. It was hunched over on the banks of the river. like a dark ball of hair. I didn't put the pieces together until it stood up. It was the creature I had seen a few moments ago, but at this close range, I could see it clearer. And what I saw was nothing short of extraordinary. Its body, stark against the morning sun, appeared covered in a thick, coarse fur. From a distance, it looked black, but the creature's hair was actually a very deep brown. It was muscular, a broad chest and powerful hind legs that looked like a mixture of human and canine. But those eyes, those were a sight that I'll never forget. They glowed like a yellow fire in the morning light. The fur that cloaked its body seemed to thin out at its face, revealing an elongated muzzle. It was even more wolf-like up close. I watched, frozen in sheer awe, forgetting any fear that gripped me. There was something almost mesmerizing about its beastly stature despite the overwhelming sense of dread. I just couldn't believe what I was looking at. I think I had caught the creature off guard, because as soon as it saw me, it took off sprinting into the tree line. And suddenly it was gone. Whatever the beast was, it seemed to want little to do with me, and for that I was grateful. The encounter hasn't kept me off the water, but I do make a point to watch my surroundings. I don't mindlessly drift off into my thoughts anymore. I keep an eye out for things unknown and undiscovered, and if you spend any time out there in the wilderness, you should too. I have something I've finally decided I need to share. Even now, I can hardly believe it myself. It was a few years ago. I'd been experiencing a severe creative block. I'm an artist and painter by trade, so that made things difficult for me. After weeks of frustration, I decided to undertake a spiritual retreat. No television, no internet, just me, nature, and my art supplies. Off the grid, as they say. I felt a pull towards the Rockies. They've always been a good source for my creativity, and I thought a trip there could snap me out of my slump. I found a remote log cabin tucked away from the world, right in the depths of the mountains. I was hoping that something in the wilderness would reignite my creative spark. I existed the first few days in a pattern of peaceful solitude, exploring during the day and painting my experiences in the evening. But I was still struggling to find creative energy. So one evening, as the sun was beginning to set, I decided to go for a hike. It might not have been too smart of me to venture out alone that late, but I was there to experience the wilderness, and so I went for it. There was a specific trail that led up towards one of the high cliffs. Its towering presence almost beckoned me. I left the cabin with very little, only taking what I thought would be necessary items. I had no need for my phone or even my sketch pad. The hike was strenuous. I was gasping for breath in the thin mountain air, but there was something therapeutic tackling the mountain, one rugged step after another. And then, as the sunlight started to fade, I saw something odd. It was just a vague shadow against the encroaching darkness. Thinking it was a bear, I backed away slowly, but there was something not right about it. As I watched the figure, I could see it moving, walking upright like a man. Was there another person out here, I wondered? If there was, they were wearing a thick fur suit because this creature appeared to be covered entirely in hair. Next, I felt the sudden vibration before I heard it. It was a low murmur that seemed to emerge from the ground itself. It was a whooping call that was as much felt as it was heard. It was so loud that I could feel the echoes deep in my chest. My hands, trembling, reached out instinctively for the sketch pad that wasn't there. As the creature melted into the forest's natural darkness, its reality began to twist in my mind as I tried to make sense of and classify what I had just seen. I retreated to my cabin, the echo of the strange call still reverberating deep in my core. My mind was a whirl of heightened senses and questions. It took me a long time to finally fall asleep that night. Though I failed to bring my sketch pad on the hike, I found my fingers itching to hold a pencil, and my mind seemed to relive each detail of the encounter. The giant figure amidst the darkness, the strange call, the feeling of being observed by violent, deep-set eyes from the forest's depth, all these turned into fuel for my creative flame. For the first time in a long while, I felt alive, completely present and raw. I woke up that morning, walked over to my sketch pad expecting to capture the memories from the prior night. What caught me off guard, however, was a series of strokes already on the page, as if someone or something had already been there. In front of me was a daunting image on the page. The figure, intricate and precise, was gargantuan. The face housed deep-set eyes, a prominent forehead, wide nostrils and a flat nose, and a heavy jaw that led down to a jutting chin. The massive body was robust. My mind raced. Had I drawn this in the middle of the night while sleepwalking, or had someone or something made its way in here while I slept? The image wasn't a bear, no, it was too odd for that. And something told me it wasn't a human either. For a long moment, I just stood there, studying the drawing, far better than anything I had created in months. I was torn between being horrified that something had been in the cabin while I slept, and being amazed at the figure that dominated my sketchpad. What creature had tiptoed so silently into my cabin and breathed life onto my sketchpad with such deftness? In the following days, I scoured the nearby woods, following any out-of-place noise or unsettling movement. Paranoid or enthusiastic, I hardly slept, instead spending my nights with a blank canvas, waiting for the unseen artist to reappear. But as the days passed into weeks, the creature, my mystery artist, remained nothing more than an elusive shadow I couldn't catch. The encounter concluded with me leaving the cabin in the Rockies. My mind was a whirlpool of questions. The sketches I discovered felt like a secret message, almost like a gift that the wilderness had bestowed upon me. My artistic muse no longer lay dormant. I found a renewed vigor in my passion for painting. My encounter was not one of horror. It was enlightening. There's a deep serenity when nature interacts with us, carving out its tales on our souls. So, that's my tale for you. I hear a lot of scary stories on here, but know that not all of the world's monsters are looking to cause harm. The one I encountered certainly did not. It was the summer of 19 when Oregon was ablaze. I remember it well. I was out there in the thick of it. I had a job out there as a firefighter, and it was all hands on deck. It is completely exhausting, terrifying, really. No matter how many fires I've faced, each one demands every ounce of your strength. Wildfires are a different beast. Their scale can be so massive that it is impossible to put into words. You would need to see one, and even then, sometimes it's unbelievable, even for me. The trees turn to ash and create a smoke so thick you taste it in your throat hours after your shift. There is a raw, untouched edge to the wilderness that is gradually erased when the trees morph into thin charcoal sculptures. But it isn't the devastation of wildfires that I want to share with you. It's a particular incident that unfolded one day my crew and I were sent deep into the Oregon wilderness. We had been dispatched to fight a fire that had grown beyond the capabilities of the local department. It was declared a state of emergency. The terrain had grown increasingly difficult as we ventured deeper into the heavy forest. The ground was littered with dry vegetation, the kind that would quickly turn to fodder for the spreading fire. Large trees loomed overhead. The day had been a long one. The fire was relentless. Even with our heavy equipment and protective gear, every fight with the flames felt like stealing victory from the hands of defeat. After hours of arduous work, we finally got a break. We took turns eating and kicking up our feet before it was time to patrol the perimeter again. I walked the edge of the fire line. The charred remains of foliage crunched beneath my boots as I made my way around. The only other sound was the crackling and hissing of cooling timber, and even that began to fade the further I moved away. In the tranquility of the after-fire, something caught my eye. Right there, amid the underbrush, was an imprint, a footprint, huge, larger than any I'd seen before. When you're hiking around fires for so long, you come across enough tracks to recognize their makers. But this was different. Shaking off the hint of fear rising in my chest, I decided to follow the trail, curiosity overcoming the dread that sensible people reserve for such situations. I led with a flashlight, the beam barely piercing through the smoggy darkness. The chilled silence of the forest was emphatic. Only the distant crackling of smoldering trees offered a sort of dissonant comfort. As I walked deeper, I felt an increasingly intense smell, like rancid meat left in the sun. It certainly wasn't the kind of smell you would expect in the aftermath of a forest fire. Suddenly, I heard a rumbling growl, low and threatening. It seemed to vibrate through the forest undergrowth, and then a deafening huff followed, and then silence. I took a half step back, instinct screaming at me to retreat. I scanned the area for the creature making the noise, but I didn't see anything. We didn't often run into wildlife out here unless the poor critter was injured during the fire. Most able-bodied creatures are long gone by the time we arrive. I took a deep breath, steadied the flashlight, and pushed forward into the darkness. I ventured further into the darkening woods, the smell growing fouler the more I pressed on. It was then I saw something in the shadows. My flashlight hit something colossal standing mere yards away from me. The sight took all the air from my lungs. It was massive, well over 8 feet tall if I had to guess. The creature was something straight out of an eerie legend, and not something I ever expected to come across. A bulging, solid figure with a broad and heavy jaw stood before me in the dim light of my flashlight. Its hairy body was coated with tones of reddish and brown. Its head seemed to slope into its enormous physique, highlighting bulky shoulders and arms. I moved the flashlight beam upwards and caught 2 high-set, sunken eyes glowing within the skeletal ridges of pronounced brow bones. It was like I was looking at the mixture of a man and a beast. It grunted, a sound so deep it echoed off the trees. The area hurriedly enveloped in an imposing silence. Every hair on my body stood on end, a raw, instinctual fear coursing through my veins. But I kept my ground in front of the creature. Then, after what seemed an eternity, it simply turned and, with a grace unexpected of such a massive brute, disappeared into the charred shadows of the forest. The rest of the night went by in a blur. I managed to disengage from my state of shock, functioning solely on autopilot. It wasn't until morning that I processed what had happened. I found myself questioning the reality of mythical creatures, wondering if the wildfire was just a destructive monster or an unforgiving force revealing what was hidden within its furnace. My encounter that night changed my perspective in ways I could not imagine. Aside from sharing humorous anecdotes with the buddies about the occasional raccoons raiding our camps, this is the first time I've ever shared this story. For fear of ridicule, I've kept it to myself. I always used to scoff at the numerous stories floating around of the creature known as Bigfoot. I figured they were all just that, stories. But now I know there is something else out there. I'm a big-time cycling enthusiast, and it feels like I've spun my wheels through just about every bike trail in my state of Pennsylvania. But let me tell you, there's no ride that beats the trail through Forbes State Forest. I always cherish these rides. There's nothing like solitude while pumping your legs tirelessly across miles in the forest. That's my idea of a perfect Saturday morning. It was one of those dew-fresh mornings. I could feel that cold, brisk air against my face as I pedaled along the trail. On this particular morning, I felt this indescribable, steely determination. It was the kind you feel deep in your gut when you truly want to challenge yourself. But I'm not writing in today to tell you about my mountain biking endeavors. Something else happened that day, and it wasn't something I'd soon forget. I was just past the steepest part of the trail and getting ready for that thrilling downhill swoop. The bike began to whiz down the hill, making the wind howl through the tunnels of trees like an otherworldly whisper. But suddenly, this strange headwind picked up. That's pretty normal when cycling downhill. But this wind felt different. It was denser, like there was something behind it. Something solid that I couldn't see. I could hear whispers tangled amidst the howling wind, quiet yet distinct. It felt like ominous murmurs riding on the breeze, speaking words I couldn't understand. Maybe it was just normal wind sounds, or maybe I was going crazy. I didn't know. But then the temperature dropped suddenly. I could see my breath every time I exhaled. This was not normal, not at all, but I just shoved it all out of my head and kept pedaling. It's not like I could stop at that point anyway. I needed to get back to the trailhead. I'd been cycling on the same route for years, and knew every twist and turn with my eyes shut. But suddenly, it was as if I didn't recognize the stretch of road I was on. The trees looked unfamiliar, and honestly, much older. This chilling gust of wind continued, and every now and then those unexplained noises would return. At one point, I was certain I heard what sounded like rattling chains in the breeze. I couldn't shake off this unsettling feeling that someone was with me. It was an odd, pulling sensation, an awareness of a slight electric charge in the air. But for all that sense of strangeness, I couldn't pinpoint what exactly was off about the situation. They say the more you try to resist something, the more it persists. The intensity of those whispered murmurs in the wind seemed to grow stronger, revolving around me, almost as if trying to communicate something. I couldn't make out words, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling they created in me. What was meant to be a solitary ride had turned into something far from peaceful. I even thought of turning back, abandoning whatever joke the universe was trying to play on me. But where was back? Now, here's the best part. I stopped, right in the middle of this foreign path, looking around trying to make sense of my location, as the whispers filled the air around me. It was then that I noticed this misty figure on the side of the road. I rubbed my eyes, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. I squinted, taking in the vague, human-like shape. It looked at me, I think. It was hard to tell since the face was, at best, a blur of wavy lines. I remember the chill with which it watched me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I still felt a sensation of being watched. With the size of it, it seemed to be the form of a person. However, its figure was translucent, kind of like heat rising off the asphalt on a summer day. But the feeling was colder. I was certain this being was the source of those disembodied whispers I had been hearing. The air began to smell musty and odd, like an old house that had fallen into disrepair. That alone was enough to trigger an alarm in my head. I reckon, right about then, adrenaline kicked in. I hopped back onto the cycle and slammed the pedals down and took off down the road. The whispers faded as I gained distance, but I swear that odd chill remained with me, prickling the back of my neck until I emerged from that stretch of road. I tell you, that couldn't have been a mere illusion or trick of the light. That figure was there. I know it was. It was as real as you and me. I am as baffled now as I was on that day, cycling through those ancient trees down the seemingly endless road. I keep trying to shake off the strange fear that grips me every time I think about that strange encounter. Each time I think about the incident, I can hear that murmuring whisper. It's as if my memory also recorded the sound. Each echo sends a chill down my spine, and it's one that sticks with me long after the visual memory fades. I've ridden down that particular stretch since, and there's been nothing. The trees seem familiar. The road is exactly how I remember it, and there are no mysterious whispers carried on the wind. I still think about it every time I cycle that route, trying to piece it all together. But I don't have answers for myself. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe it was just nature playing tricks and pulling off a spectral showcase of its hidden mysteries, or perhaps it was something even more sinister. I can never be sure, but that's my story. I can't tell you the date because, in all honesty, the whole thing was such a shock to me. But here's what I remember. It was late autumn, and I was living near an old factory at the time. I remember hearing stories about it as a kid. Ghost stories and made-up monster stories. That type of thing. Then I moved away and lived in the city for a while, but something made me miss home and I came back. By then, my childhood home had long been sold, and in my budget range, the small house near the old factory was my best option. I could see it from my windows, and to be honest, it put me on edge. There wasn't any particular reason for it, besides my memories of the near-forgotten ghost stories from my childhood. Still, there was an uneasy stillness about it. It felt like something was there that shouldn't be. I never shook that feeling the entire time I lived there. Whatever may or may not be in that abandoned factory didn't seem to want to bother me. As long as the factory remained quiet and nothing happened, I decided I could stay and continue life as usual. Besides getting out of the house to go to work, I was a homebody. I had taken up a bit of amateur carpentry and practiced that in my spare time. I set up a desk in the living room of my little house and spent quite a while working at it. Even from there, I could see the factory right outside the window. It was strange to say the least, and that never changed. I would see shadows moving in the old building. It was as if something was living in there. Hopefully just a wild animal, I thought. We had several species of wildlife in the area that would likely be happy to take up residence in the factory, but I couldn't shake that uncanny sense of dread. This went on for weeks. I always thought myself a bit of a skeptic. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. The shadows moving around the factory at night were probably just raccoons or possums, looking for a dry, covered space to live. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I was at the table one night, working on a carpentry project that just wasn't going my way. I was starting to zone out, and as I did, I caught myself staring at the empty factory. There was definitely something in there. But what was it? I watched, almost mechanically, as the shadows shifted again. And there it was. And it certainly wasn't something from out of the wild. The silhouette was roughly human, albeit much larger. Its face was gaunt, and its body was disgustingly thin, as if it hadn't eaten a meal for months. I could hear my heart beat audibly. I wouldn't be surprised if it was loud enough for the creature to hear it too. I don't know what it was. I couldn't tell if it was sick, or if that was its normal appearance. It moved with the swiftness of a predator. It didn't wear any clothes that I could see, which is the only reason I concluded that it wasn't human. And while its emaciated body was undoubtedly disturbing, it was the face, or rather the lack of it, that held my gaze. Where the eyes should have been were large black voids. I watched the creature, its skin so pale it almost emitted a ghostly sheen under the muted headlights that passed the factory now and then. It made these strange clicking noises from time to time, echoing eerily around the silence of the factory and out the broken windows for me to hear. I felt like I was in a scene from a horror movie, and I wished helplessly for my mundane, ordinary nights to return. During those days, I had a hard time relaxing, even breathing. It was as if time had stopped. I had a moment of clarity and rushed to my phone to call someone, but I didn't know who. What authorities could I call that deal with monsters in the dark? Do I call the city, the state patrol, the wildlife officers? I wasn't even sure if this creature was something from the natural world or not. I settled on calling the police. The quiver in my voice must have been apparent. The operator assured me that a squad car was on the way. When help finally arrived, the shadows in the factory returned to lifelessness. The officers, despite their investigative professionalism, couldn't hide their skepticism. They apologized for the inconvenience, said it was probably teenagers messing around, or maybe I had just seen an animal. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak, every rustle of leaves out my window was now part of a horror story that was slowly unfolding around me. The dread hung heavy in my mind. Believe it or not, I'm still here, but the days are strange now. The factory has been quiet, but I don't feel safe at all around it. I am looking for new housing, but my search isn't going as well as I had hoped. As I write this, I still live next to the factory, and therefore near the creature that lives inside it. I try to go about my day, but I can't rid myself of the fear that I will see it again. What if that creature decides to come outside? What if it comes over here? I am certain it knows that I live here, just as I know that it lives in that old factory. I have an unusual tale to share with you. I love the outdoors. I love to hike and backpack. I've run into quite a few species of wildlife over the years, and occasionally an odd person or two. But what happened on this day, well, it's something else entirely. In fact, I'm still not quite sure what to think about it. It happened last June, and I haven't talked about it since. I'm a high school science teacher, and so I have my summers off. That summer, I was on a solo 2-week backpacking trip through the Cascades. It's an area I've frequented for years. I try to get out there as much as possible. I had taken a different trail than normal that time. No reason in particular for my deviation. I guess I was just looking to explore new areas. A couple of days in, and I found this old, abandoned campsite. There aren't many campsites this far out. Most people ascribe to the leave no trace principles. So, to find somebody's campsite is pretty darn unusual. There were a few things strewn about. An old pot rusting next to a stone circle that had once served as a campfire, an aged and faded canvas tent collapsed on one side, and a moldy backpack. I spent some time looking around the area. It didn't make sense for hikers to leave their tent and backpack behind. I was getting worried that I might have stumbled upon the last known whereabouts of a missing camper. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started rummaging around the site. The tent was old, like those canvas things that people used before you could buy an ultra-lightweight, space-saving, self-pitching style at the local sports retailer. That gnarly thing looked like it could stand up to a hurricane. Bearing my weight on it, I propped it up, and a cloud of dust kicked up from the ordeal, which made me curse and wave my hat around in a desperate bid for fresh air. The rucksack was downright fascinating. Inside it, I found a bag of what used to be trail mix now taken over by some sort of small critter. All at once, just as the sun was hitting its peak, I felt this odd feeling. It was hard to explain, almost as if someone or something was watching me. Now, I've spent enough time hiking to know that sometimes you're not alone in the wilderness. It could be animals or other hikers, but this felt different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was a sensation I'd not felt in a long time. Bear in mind, I hadn't seen or heard a soul for days, which was no surprise out here. The wilderness does frequently remind you just how tiny your piece of existence is. But there was something terribly wrong here, and it wasn't just that abandoned campsite. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a sound that I'll never forget. It was a deep huff, followed by a low, resonating growl. It echoed through the trees, making the leaves rustle and birds flutter away in fright. At first, I thought it was a bear, and I can tell you for certain that I wouldn't want to encounter a bear so close on a trail. But as I would soon find out, there are creatures more terrifying than bears out there in the wild. Suddenly, the earth vibrated beneath me, like I was standing next to a large stampeding animal. Turning on my heels, I stepped backward in shock as the colossal figure burst into view. Its towering form shadowed the clearing in its wake. It had to be near about 9 feet tall. Its body was robust. I could see the thick, coarse hair covering its entire form, except for the face and hands. The hair was a shimmering reddish hue as the sun's rays hit it. I'm a big man myself, but this creature made me look pitifully small. And boy, the smell. A rancid, putrid odor crept over me, thick and heavy. It was its face that really got my heart pounding, though. Broad cheekbones warped into a bulging forehead, leading to deep-set eyes that were as dark as midnight. Its wide nostrils flared, repeating that unsettling huffing sound. It was like a mix between a man and an ape, like some sort of missing link of human evolution, but much, much larger. It bared its teeth at me. I don't know if it was simply showing its strength, or if it was a direct threat. Shaking from the sight, I found myself instinctively crawling back toward my camp gear. My safely propped up tent now looked like a flimsy sanctuary in the face of this hulking beast. The growl repeated, louder this time, rolling through the campsite like a thundercrack, and making me stumble over the worn tent ropes as I backed away. With a loud snarl, it took a step forward. For all its heft, the creature was surprisingly agile. I didn't stick around to marvel at its next move. Gathering my wits about me, I bolted. Through the thick underbrush, past old oaks, I ran until my lungs burned, and then I ran some more. I was finally under the cautious safety of a new hidden camping spot, but I still spent the night wide awake. I don't know how I managed to evade that creature, but somehow I did. And I can tell you, though, that I never went back there. I'm not sure what happened to the people from that abandoned campsite, but I don't imagine anything good came to them if they met that creature like I did. The encounter left a profound impact on me, leaving me questioning my brave solo hiking trips. I can't settle in the wilderness the way I used to before I knew of the creature's existence. This isn't a story I wanted to share, but I think people need to know that there are real, live monsters out there. And if you are heading out to enjoy some solitude in the wilderness, you had better be careful and be prepared for anything. I'm the lighthouse keeper down by the South Ledge. Been here going on 8 years now. It's an old, weather-beaten structure, carrying the history of 100 years' worth of storms and rough seas. But it's home to me. The lighthouse has brought me a sense of peace I didn't know I had been missing. It's not a life everyone would choose, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's a solitary existence out here. You have a lot of time to think, to discover yourself, to come to terms with what life throws at you. You can't hide anything in the sound of crashing waves and infinite darkness. The truth has a way of seeping in. I never felt lonely though. Got my books for company, and there are always ships to keep an eye on. Each night I conduct my rounds, lighting the mechanism, polishing the lens, checking the weather reports. I go up to the watchroom and watch over the sea. It's calming, methodical even. Sometimes the ships would pass, and I would watch the tiny specks of their lights. This particular story begins on a string of foggy nights. Midnight would come around, and with it the fog, thick and heavy. The sea would grow hazy, and it would become more difficult to see. The ships blurred to ghostly shadows. It all started as a strange rhythm of splashes. A ship slicing through the water has a crisp sound to it if you listen long enough. This wasn't that. It was a deep, rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of the sea itself. Something big was out there, swimming not far from the rocky coastline. I couldn't see it, of course. The fog was too dense, too stubborn. But I could hear it and feel its presence. It was only a vague sensation at first, an uneasiness that itched at the back of my mind. But each night, it grew more pronounced, more tangible, and more consistent. There were other signs too. A foul odor, like brine and rotting seaweed, that seemed to linger in the air. Unsettling roars echoed from out at sea, low and guttural, making the windows of the lighthouse shudder. I started to question the solitude I once found comforting. But let me tell you, there's something about fear and curiosity that tend to keep each other company. So I stuck with it and hoped it was just a rogue sea creature passing by, or at worst a big ship that had lost its way in the fog. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something I was yet to understand. The lighthouse began to feel more like a fortress than a beacon with me inside, and some unknowable beast on the outside. I didn't know what lurked in the whites of the sea mist, but I knew I had to stay vigilant and confront whatever came my way. Running wasn't an option. This was my patch, and I wasn't about to let some unidentified creature in the dark chase me out. I decided to keep watch and stay meticulous, sticking to the routine. But little did I know, everything was about to change. On a particularly chilly night, I sat by the lens room, the book in my hand. I had grown increasingly restless, wandering between the fog outside and the unnerving silence within. The rhythmic splashes grew louder and demanded my undivided attention. The foul odor was denser that night, and the low roars echoed ominously in the dark. But this time, the sea did more than whisper its secret. On the horizon, something moved. Outlined against the misty backdrop, it rose from the deep. Its silhouette was enormous, dwarfing the ships that dared to venture nearby. It was vague but unfathomably huge. It swam right under the surface, casting a colossal serpentine shadow below the water. A sense of dread, primal and paralyzing, ensnared me. I could make out a long, sinuous body, lined with scales that shimmered in the ghostly glow of the night. There was a dreadful splash that sounded like thunder. Something colossal rose from the sea. I couldn't tell if it was the tentacle or the neck of some serpent. Water cascaded from it like a cloak. It emitted an earth-shattering roar, and silence fell upon us. Then it was gone. The sea calmed itself. The fog reclaimed the distance, and whatever had graced my view for those haunting moments receded into the abyss. I was left in the hollow aftermath of the encounter. My book sat on the weathered floor, while the rhythmic splashes echoed in the silence like the phantom pain of a lost limb. In the days that followed, my routine didn't change, but I had. During the day, the sea was my old friend again, pristine and peaceful. But as the veil of fog descended each night, so deepened my fascination. Every whisper of the wind, every creak of the aged building reverberated with an otherworldly echo. My solitude wasn't lonely anymore, but it was frightening. I caught myself looking out to sea more often, waiting, listening, hoping for the enigma to reveal itself. The sea monster, as I had taken to calling it, didn't grace me with another visit. I continue to read by lamplight, but my mind often drifts to that chance encounter. The fear has faded over time, replaced by an odd longing. On foggy nights, I still keep watch for it, but the mighty creature keeps its secrets, leaving me yearning and forever in awe of the mysteries hidden beneath the waves. This thing of beauty and terror, a beast straight out of the folklore and into the fog-fringed sea by my lighthouse, gave me this seemingly unbelievable story to tell. I just know something's out there in the deep sea, something we have yet to discover. Have a great episode for you today with an actual photo sent in from a listener. Let's get right to it. Dear Donovan, for years I'd been tightly clamped inside the mysterious gears of a government job at an undisclosed facility. If I painted you this picture of being a cold, cool Secret Service agent, think again. The reality, quite frankly, was much starker. Number crunching, paperwork, and year-round flu, complete with sneezes and coughs. I'm not here to bore you with the file pushing, coffee brewing, and mundane environment of working a job that's never revealed. I have quite the extraordinary tale to share that crept into my life a few years ago, a time when I thought Naughty Noodles was as weird as it gets. How wrong I was. You know, there are reasons you keep something hush-hush, a surprise party, a special proposal, or even a top-secret government facility, holding what we would say are, well, foreign matters. And when you stumble on something that rattles your beliefs and shakes up your reality, it's hard not to pry. My story begins in the monotonous labyrinth of the facility, around 5 years back. We always had underground bunkers, levels that even had clearance level names so hush-hush that it was practically espionage to speak about them out loud. As an analyst, I wasn't typically involved in the physically covert aspects, content with my mind-boggling data sets, and report deadlines. One day, we had an unexpected system shutdown, and I was assigned to assist with the maintenance team. My job was to keep track of what files and records were recovered, confirming their order, and reinstating the system models, and a load of way above my pay grade tech jargon. It was somewhere in that nerve-wracking process that I accidentally accessed a file I wasn't meant to, finding a picture that was well beyond what I expected. In it, shrouded in a kind of strange mist, stood a peculiar creature, a being of about 4 to 6 feet tall, captured in its full glory, even though nestled in the foggy background. At first, I dismissed it as a prank, a manipulated picture designed to mess up with the rookie. There was something so captivating about it, yet unnerving in a weird way. It was an interesting mix of shadows and mystery that looked unlike anything I'd seen before. Its eyes, they were hypnotic, so dark that they just seemed to consume you. I noticed that the area they documented had a high voltage mark, as if whatever they held was something quite dangerous, or should I say, electrically unusual. I was not sure what to believe, yet there was a nagging feeling that made me push through my fears and press further onto this cloak and dagger situation. Little did I know, I was about to uncover something that would not only shift my perception of life, but send it spiraling down an enigma of intergalactic proportions. To be honest, Donovan, I hadn't seen the half of it. I could barely breathe, barely contain the sudden realization. Was this foreign matters, an alien matter? The thought clung to my mind, unraveling like a spool of thread as I stared at this absurd, yet chilling image. As ludicrous as it seemed, all roads led to this extraterrestrial explanation. What other explanation could there be? As my heart pounded in my chest, I knew I was stumbling onto something that was not meant for my eyes. Perhaps my understanding. Hesitant yet drawn by an inexplicable urge and curiosity, I downloaded the image onto a flash drive I always carried with me, sweat accumulating on my forehead, my hands shaking as if that single file weighed a ton. In the realm of bureaucratic routines and mind-numbing work, this was a shock. The existence of extraterrestrials was something from TV shows, books, and far-out theories, not our everyday life. But staring at the image, I was thrown into the deep end of this uncharted universe of secrets, an unsettling perspective that would have sent any ardent disbeliever into a corner to question everything they knew. Securing the picture was a leap of faith in the unknown kingdom of dread. What if they found out? What if this secret was too big to be overlooked? I was an average Joe in a suit unfit to unveil intergalactic lies. But then again, what was I supposed to do? The truth was right before me. Post-downloading the image, I managed to return to the monotony of my job, but my mind remained a whirlwind, the alien picture embedded deep in my thoughts. Days turned into weeks, but I could hardly sleep, barely eat, and my concentration dwindled down to nothing. I would often catch myself staring blankly at the coffee machine, lost in the realms of what-ifs. Could I go public about the photograph and its implications? Would anyone believe me? Or would I be labeled and discarded as another nut job? In the end, I accepted that the truth was stranger than fiction. I admitted to myself that those black, haunting eyes were not from this world. Aliens were real and among us, drenched in the government's secrets, and hiding right beneath our uncertain noses. A realization that awakened me, and I was no longer the same person. I walked the path of a believer, yet the only evidence I held was a single image. An image of undeniable evidence that shattered my normality, and replaced it with an ever-present, unsettling truth. I then made a decision to step out of the shadow of that daunting revelation. Here I am, Donovan, telling you, ready to walk the labyrinth of conspiracies, government cover-ups, and the vast eccentric universe that is dancing right under our oblivious eyes. I was ready for the world that was tuned into your show, ready to spill the truth, an unearthing of cosmic proportions, and shake the foundations of our realities. That would be all for now, Donovan. That's my story of an unsuspecting encounter with an alien existence that forever changed my life. Thank you for the opportunity to share my truth. I've got a pretty wild story to share with you. I'm a police officer and was patrolling down near the border of Arizona and Mexico. It was a pretty quiet area, but the desert can be more than creepy after dark. The moon was out that night, I remember that. It was a particularly lonely stretch of desert road, and the light of the moon didn't do much to make it any more inviting. The desert comes alive at night, but the shadows are hiding spots for the nocturnal creatures. I wouldn't say I was afraid of the dark, but I can say that I don't like surprises. These border patrol assignments can get pretty monotonous. You have way too much time on your hands, and you start to think about things. It can be a dark, boring, lonely meander through the dirt, dust, rocks, and cacti. More clock watching than anything else. It's normally a pretty routine job. That night, though, Something seemed off. You know that feeling at the back of your neck, like something or someone is watching you? A kind of buzz in the silence of the desert, or a chill in the air that signals that something just isn't quite right. It was that kind of feeling, and I couldn't shake it. It was just past midnight and I spotted something. It was an unusual figure darting across the landscape like some startled animal, but bigger than anything I felt comfortable with. It was bigger than any damn coyote or mountain lion I've ever seen in this area. I couldn't make out exactly what I was seeing from that distance, but there was a sense of wrongness about it. Like whatever it wasn't supposed to be here. All my senses were on high alert then. This definitely wasn't part of the job. I tried catching up with the figure, having that reflexive urge to apprehend an illegal border crosser. Rookie mistake. I found myself rushing into the unknown after this mysterious figure. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins, and my unease was building. I wasn't sure if I was hoping it would be an animal or a person. I really didn't want to have an encounter with anything larger than a fox, but the creature I had just seen was definitely something more impressive than that. What I found, or rather what found me, didn't resemble any animal I've ever known, and to this day I can't fully explain it. It finally stopped running from me and turned around. It was like it had decided it was done running, and that it would challenge me instead. The night was quiet, as if it were waiting for an oncoming fight. Despite not being able to make heads nor tails of the situation, I braced for a confrontation. My hand was on my radio in case I needed to call for help if necessary. The wind blew through the towering cacti, and the lonely hills gave off an eerie whisper. The landscape around me began to close in, the shadows stretching out against the moonlit sand, and I just knew I was not dealing with an illegal border crosser here. The figure, now brought into sharp focus by my flashlight, made me take a step back in shock and horror. For instead of a fear-stricken human face, what met my gaze was a fierce creature out of a science fiction nightmare, standing at an incredible height, rivaling my own 6-foot stance, and peering at me with cold, slitted eyes was what I can only describe as a dinosaur. It was a humanoid, or so it seemed, with a lizard-like head filled with sharp teeth. Its eyes glowed yellow against the beam of my flashlight. Its gaze held intelligence and cunning, but it was the teeth that I was focused on. If this thing tried to attack me, I knew I wouldn't stand a chance. Its body was a grotesque display of heavy-plated scales. They shimmered, almost glowed under the moonlight. If the creature itself wasn't so terrifying, I would say it was almost beautiful in a way. The moment seemed to stretch on forever as we locked gazes, a part of my mind stuttering in total denial, while the practical part was readying to radio and backup. The creature, meanwhile, was holding a device. Something shone brightly in the moonlight, but its purpose or intent I could not fathom. I tried to move, my fingers instinctively twitching towards my holster, but I was frozen. I still don't know if it was fear or some other inexplicable force that held me back, but just as abruptly as it had appeared, with a slight adjustment to the strange device in its hand, it vanished. What followed was a still silence. The chilling encounter left me rooted at the spot, for God knows how long as my mind grappled with the reality of what just happened. Later, driving back to the outpost, alone in the patrol vehicle, the desert outside more alien than before, I had a tough choice to make whether to report the incident or not. In the end, I didn't. Who would believe such a story? Even I was questioning my sanity. But as the days rolled into weeks and months, instead of fading into a distant memory, this encounter was something I found myself coming back to, again and again, its reality still raw and vivid. So now I'm sharing it here. What I saw was real. I don't know what it was or where it came from, or maybe more importantly, where it went. The creature was clearly intelligent. I don't want to come right out and say, I think it was from another planet, but where else could it have gone? Maybe someone else out there has an idea. Or maybe one of you have seen one of these things out in the desert after dark. It was just another morning in Plainfield, Iowa, in the spring of last year. Waking up before dawn has always been a part of this way of life. Or maybe it's just the habit. The difference is, as a farmer, your clock is the rooster crowing in the distance, signaling the start of a new day of work. Out here, miles away from the nearest neighbor, we take pride in being stewards of the land. My family's been maintaining this Iowa farmland for generations. We've got about 200 acres of corn on the farm. It's a tough job, but it keeps us busy. That morning, I remembered an eerie calm wash over the fields. You know when you just sense that something's out of place? A thick, early morning fog made it hard to see the fields in detail, but even through the fog, I could tell something was wrong. The fog lifted and the sun rose, and I headed out to the fields. Rows of green corn stalks lay flattened, intricately spiraling out from a central point like a dizzying maze. I'd seen crop circles on the news before and pegged them as pranks by people with nothing better to do. But this was different. Now, I'm not a man who leaps to conclusions. I've learned not to do that on the farm. But I couldn't explain how anyone could have achieved such an intricate design overnight, and without me hearing a thing. Hell, we don't even have fancy drones in this part of the state. Not that any local prankster would have the money for one. The crop circles got me thinking. It wasn't about the lost harvest, but more about the mystery itself. I guess the farmer in me saw a problem to investigate, not a paranormal mystery, but a pest problem with an unusually creative approach. I decided on setting up some surveillance around the farm. I didn't even tell my wife. She would have thought that I had lost my marbles. I had my old hunting stuff lying around, including a night vision trail camera I used to track wildlife during deer season. I dusted off the old thing and set it up on the edge of one of the fields near the crop circles. As day turned into night, I settled in the den, my eyes fixed upon the grainy feed coming from the camera. Every motion sensor blip, every rustle of the wind, heightened my anticipation. As the tall silhouette of the cornfield swayed ominously under the gray shroud of the night, my eyes struggled to adjust to the grainy black and white feed. Sometime around midnight, I saw a figure. It was barely visible from a distance. A wiry figure emerged from the rows, moving with an ethereal grace. It was skinny, with a head too big for its frame and features that were humanoid but grotesquely stretched out. The night vision camera didn't pick up color, so I didn't know if it had that famous alien gray skin. All I knew was that it stood with an uncanny lanky silhouette against the backdrop of my cornfield. The figure stood still for a few moments, looking towards my house with those big, black, oval eyes. I held my breath. My blood ran cold, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I struggled to wrap my mind around what was happening. I know what it looked like, but it was like my mind didn't want to believe it. The creature walked around the flattened corn stalks and looked to the sky. Maybe it had friends around, I don't know. But as it was scanning the area, it noticed the camera. It looked right into. It was like it was staring right through me. I knew that it couldn't see me, but it felt like it could. I was terrified. And then, just like that, it was gone. The creature disappeared right into thin air, as if it had never been there. The sudden stillness of the field was almost as terrifying as the encounter itself. As I sat there, my mind raced. What was it doing there? And how did it recognize the camera? I didn't know. All I knew was that during the course of one night, my world turned upside down. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, just sat there in front of the camera feed as the adrenaline left my body and daybreak began to light up the room. The following days were filled with uneasy thoughts. I felt like I was straddling the line between two worlds. A part of me tied to the mundane practicality of running a farm, the other part in constant fear of the unknown entity that I had seen on the trail cam. I was plagued with thoughts. Was the creature alone? Would it come back? And why here? What did it want? Every creak of the house at night, every unintended movement in the dark, my mind twisted it into signs of the creature returning. Many nights later, I am still here watching the fields through my trail camera, just a simple farmer and an unlikely witness to the unknown. I wish I hadn't seen what I had seen, but now I can't stop thinking about it. I have more trail cams set up these days, hoping to catch them if they come back. Thus far, I've only caught images of deer and foxes wandering in the night. No signs our friends have returned. No crop circles. No nothing. I'm afraid I'll never know what the creature wanted or why it came to my field. I can only sit here and wonder. I've got a wild story from the time when I was working as a park ranger in Alaska. The wilderness there is almost indescribable. Just miles and miles of pristine beauty, completely untouched by man. The summer months are amazing, but when winter rolls around, it can get brutal. The cold there reaches inside you and touches your bones. At the time, I was working in this isolated station, which was a good 2-day trek from civilization. Such isolation can take its toll on some people, but I always found the solitude comforting. It was midwinter, and the entire landscape was veiled in a blanket of fresh snow. As stunning as it was, every creature had to work twice as hard for survival, including me. Part of my daily duties involved monitoring trap lines set up in the area. In addition to the cold, conquering the rugged terrain was just as merciless under all this snow. These traps were spread out across a good stretch, requiring me to traverse dense forests that teemed with all sorts of wild critters. Evidence of animal activity was quite frequent: claw marks on tree trunks, flattened shrubs, and even an occasional carcass here or there. It was the reality of wilderness, raw and unfiltered. I remember that morning like it was yesterday. It was absolutely frigid, and frost covered the windows of my truck. I set out on my usual route, but it wasn't long before things took a strange turn. I noticed certain irregularities that I ended up shrugging off as odd coincidences. When you get that far out in the woods, the lines between the rational and the irrational blur more often than you'd think, especially when you are dealing with extreme weather. But I carry on, eager to get back to the warmth of the station. I was halfway through my rounds when I stumbled upon a trap, which was not just sprung, but ripped to shreds. Most of these were bear traps. They are pretty damn sturdy contraptions. I had never seen anything like it before. The steel jaws were torn apart like they were made of paper. There were scratches on the ground and signs of struggle, but nothing that indicated the catch had freed itself. I did a quick survey of the area and was suddenly hit by a putrid stench. It was the unmistakable scent of rotting meat, and it was growing more potent with each passing second. It was definitely rancid, and not something I would expect to find in a carcass at these temperatures. Anything long dead would be frozen out here. There was something else in the air too. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the atmosphere suddenly felt heavy, oppressive even. Backing away from the unsettling stench and that strange feeling, I tried to regain my senses. As the day wore on, the nauseating aroma still hung in the background and seemed to get worse. You've smelled a carcass before, sure, but this was distinctly quite vile. It was akin to death and decay, being stewed over a slow fire. Now, I'm not one to scare easily, but I can tell you that the woods felt off that day. The usual rustling of leaves was subdued, the common calls and melodious chirping eerily absent, as though every creature was holding its breath. The tall trees cast long, dark shadows that seemed to be hiding things far more sinister. I trudged through the heavy snow. The crunch of my boots was the only sound defying the silence. I felt an uneasiness creep up my spine. Something felt very, very wrong. The raw wilderness that I had come to appreciate over my years of service suddenly seemed menacing, but I pressed on. I wanted to get this job done as quick as possible, so I could get back to the station. As I continued, I began noticing anomalous claw marks on the trees around me, and strange tracks. They were twisted hoof-like prints mixed with the semblance of a human foot. I've seen deer tracks and bear tracks, but nothing like this. It was way bigger than anything I was familiar with. Strange sounds filled the air, so incoherent yet deeply unsettling. Every rustle of leaves and snapping of twigs started painting horrifying images in my head. I tried chalking it up to my own fear and overactive imagination, but then I began experiencing this sense of being watched. From the corner of my eye, I started seeing distorted glimpses of movements in the trees. I stood frozen for a moment, fighting the urge to flee. I knew I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. It was an ancient evil that I thought lived only in near-forgotten folktales. My fear argued furiously with my sense of duty, and the former won. I decided the best course of action would be to report these findings and return to the station. I didn't need to see the creature to know what made those tracks wasn't natural. It wasn't any creature I had encountered before in my line of work. This was something else. The forest wasn't the same. It felt like a hollow echo chamber for my fears, feeding on my insecurity and amplifying it back at me. I had heard enough old stories to know what makes hooves tracks and smells of rotten flesh. I won't say the name, but I'm sure you can figure it out. The folk around here claim that speaking the word aloud calls it to you. I still work out there in the wild, and I don't want any trouble with this thing. Never ever in my life have I felt such an overpowering sense of dread as I did that day. That encounter and the lingering uncertainty altered my perception of the pristine Alaskan wilderness forever. But remember, if you ever find yourself alone in the Alaskan wilderness, make sure you keep your wits about you. And if you think something is watching you, I'm sorry to say, you're probably right. This was definitely one of the stranger summer adventures my buddies and I ever experienced. 4 years ago, around this same time of year, we formed a small, amateur spelunking group. We all grew up in the nooks and crannies of Nashville, Tennessee, and we all had an insatiable curiosity for the unknown. One weekend, armed with headlamps, ropes, and well-packed backpacks, we set out to explore an intriguing network of caves at the heart of Tennessee. Since none of us were too afraid of stuffy, enclosed spaces, caving had become sort of a tradition amongst us. To us, it was a journey into a different dimension almost. The endless tunnels and unexplored chambers kept us more than occupied. There was something unexplainable about being in the belly of the uninhabited earth. You were utterly disconnected from the rest of the world. We had been exploring for half the day when we found a secluded chamber, hidden away from the others like a forgotten section. From what we could see, it was scarred with what seemed like primitive cave paintings. Incredible, we all thought, as we observed the intricate faded art left there by someone long ago. What a find, we thought. It wasn't every day you came across something like that, even on explorations like this. As we moved deeper, my buddy Jeff, the most experienced of our lot, suggested we venture a bit further into the cave. Now, I want to emphasize here that we were all usually very cautious. We knew the risks of this hobby, especially when it came to squeezing in and out of tight, unexplored spaces, and we had our set of rules. However, that day, as if persuaded by Jeff's enthusiasm, we decided to bypass those rules. I think we'd all admit that sometimes our sense of adventure gets the best of us. That is what happened that day. Deeper into the shadows we ventured. We moved away from the fading traces of the ancient cave artistry. We bypassed craggy rock formations, crawled through some dangerously narrow spaces, and climbed up a steep and slippery rock face that we likely wouldn't have done on a normal day. But this day was anything but normal. I remember the strange feeling of being watched. I wasn't sure what it was all about at first. It was a peculiar sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get if something is watching you from some unseen spot. The cave was silent except for the occasional dripping of water echoing through the cave, like a strange rhythmic click. Although our headlamps lit our immediate surroundings, the darkness, it seemed, was somehow sentient. It watched and waited. The thought unnerved me. I tried to brush the feeling off as a case of the cave jitters, but it kept creeping back like a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Just when I thought things couldn't get any more unsettling, we stumbled upon an extremely tight passage. A passageway so small, it seemed more like climbing into the mouth of a beast than a part of a cave structure. But Jeff, ever the explorer, decided it was our only way forward. And so, one by one, pulling in deep breaths and sucking in our guts, we slipped into the maw of the darkness. It was at that juncture that things truly began to unravel. About halfway into the narrow passageway, the air around us started to feel different. It was heavier. Even the cave's peculiar smell began to change. The walls didn't just echo our soft footsteps and short breaths anymore, but also a strange, barely audible clicking sound. It felt like it was bouncing off the walls, coming from everywhere but nowhere at once. I brushed my hand against the damp cave wall and let out a low whistle. Does anyone feel that? Silence. A shared, strained silence told me we were all feeling it. I remember my heart pounding as the idea of an unseen presence loomed all around us. It felt unnerving, eerie even. Something about this doesn't feel right, Russ voiced out, mirroring my thoughts. His voice bounced off the cave walls. That's when we saw it. At first, it was just a movement in the shadows, too fast to track, like a blur across our headlamp beams. It was silent for a good long minute, but then came the clicking sound. It was louder now, chilling us to the core. Following our better instincts, we turned around to retreat. I was the last to exit the small passageway. As I looked back one last time, I saw something I'll never be able to forget. There in the darkness was a pale and gaunt, human-like creature, silently lurking in the shadows where we just were. It was on all fours, crouched in a way human bodies weren't meant to bend. Its head seemed too big for its body, and its face was disturbingly empty. All I could make out were two frighteningly large black eyes and a gaping mouth. By the time I slipped out of the narrow passage, sheer terror propelled me through the rest of the cave. We rushed to the entrance. We had all seen that thing. That night, we didn't speak about what happened. We went back to our ordinary lives, carrying an extraordinary secret. Looking back now, I still find myself hanging between the realms of fear and fascination. What was it that we stumbled upon that day? Was it the guardian of that ancient artwork, or something more sinister that had taken up residence deep in the caves? Although I yearn for answers, my survival instincts keep me away from that place. Whatever that thing was, I don't imagine I want to have a close encounter with it. I've never seen another creature like that since, but I have felt that uncanny feeling again once or twice. That feeling of being watched from somewhere in the darkness. I've learned my lesson. Whenever that feeling creeps up on me out in the wilderness, I turn tail and head back to the car. This unbelievable tale happened in my previous line of work as a Jersey cab driver. I was quite the night owl back then. I much preferred the witching hour over the craziness of rush hour traffic. I've picked up all sorts of interesting folks during those graveyard shifts. But one night, one fare, stands out from the rest. Late fall in New Jersey tends to have a certain chill in the air, no matter the actual temperature or the time of day. That night was a particularly cold one, with frost starting to lay on the edge of the car windows. Just after midnight, I was near a usually bustling part of town that was practically deserted at the time. My dispatcher directed me to a pickup. It was a lone guy waiting outside an old neighborhood bar that's definitely seen better days. The guy was unusual, you could tell that from a mile away. But that was part of the job sometimes. I was there to pick up people that needed a ride, whoever they may be. The man was tall, older, and was wearing a faded flannel and jeans. He was carrying nothing but a small bag that looked as ragged as him. He asked to be dropped at an address I wasn't familiar with at first, which is a rarity for me. I've covered practically every nook and cranny of Jersey throughout my time on the wheels. As he spoke the address, I realized it was over in the Pine Barrens, not a place you'd typically get a fare to, especially this late at night. The drive initially was quiet. The hum of the car engine was the only thing interrupting the silence. As we moved farther from the heart of the city, I watched as the urban jungle gave way to withering fields and patches of woodland stretching into the distance. Faint city lights in the rearview mirror were gradually replaced by the pitch-black darkness of the countryside. The passenger didn't say much during the ride. He just sat there, his gaze fixed outside the window, unblinking. The shift from the usually busy streets to the secluded Pine Barrens area magnified the eeriness of the night. Every crackle of the radio and chime from the meter seemed louder than usual. Blame it on my wild imagination, or the creepy stories I heard as a kid. But the solitude of the night coupled with the strange passenger was starting to make me uneasy. Just then, the cab lights flickered, and I thought I caught a strange smell. It was pungent, almost like sulfur. This was an eerie part of the world. The forests around us seemed unnaturally silent, but little did I know at that point that this was only the beginning of a long, unforgettable night. After dropping off the fare in a rundown farmhouse that was barely noticeable amongst the thick woodland, he just waved me off without a word. I saw the dim light inside the house flicker briefly and then die out. As I maneuvered my cab to make the return trip, I caught sight of something by the corner of my eye that made my heart stop. In a clearing by a pond, lit up by the glow of the full moon, I saw what I later came to identify as the infamous Jersey Devil. It was hunched over the water, its bat-like wings folded over its bizarre, terrifying body. The creature seemed to be about 5 feet tall, with hawked legs and scales covering most of its body. The body itself was in a form similar to that of a white-tailed deer, but that's where the similarities end. Its head was strangely similar to a goblin or a ghoul. The snout was long and twisted. The creature's eyes glowed red in the dark. The creature seemed fixated on its reflection in the pond. The overwhelming odor of sulfur filled the cab. It was so strong my eyes were watering. I was frozen where I sat, a primordial fear gluing me in my place. I blinked, half hoping the creature would be gone when I opened my eyes, but it stood there, unmoved. That's when I noticed the most terrifying feature. The creature had a skeletal exterior, somewhat disguised by its scales, with an exterior skull that was undeniably demonic. Finally, spurred by fear and the instinct to survive, I tried to start the cab to get the hell away from there. But, as if aware of my presence, the creature turned its monstrous head towards me. Gone was the distant gaze. Now, those glowing eyes were fixed on me. My cabbie instincts of always being on the move kicked in, and I turned the ignition again. Mercifully, the cab came back to life, the sound of the engine startling the creature. With one last look my way, the Jersey Devil spread its wings, unfurling them in all their horrifying glory, and lifted off, disappearing into the dark sky. I wasted no time and floored the gas pedal, the cab lurching forward, away from the pond and towards the familiarity of the city. Despite my terror, a sense of awe hung over me as I raced down the deserted highway. I had seen it, the Jersey Devil, the thing of urban legends and late-night radio shows. I'd shrugged off those tales as long as I can remember. But now, well, let's just say those solitary night drives took on a new depth. Sometimes I catch myself looking in the shadows for another glimpse of the creature, almost hoping to see it again, just for the reassurance that what I saw was real.